My name is Dan Staines. I'm a PhD student of Malcolm Rhines, who organised this whole thing. For a while now, we've been working on a game for moral education. The idea is that, yeah, we can use games to make people better people. And we've been using the insights of moral psychology and moral education in particular to do that. Today, what I want to talk about is a little more general. I want to talk about the insights and opportunities that moral psychology offers to game designers designing moral content for games that aren't necessarily for education. It could be for any reason. It could be for entertainment or whatever. So let's start first with a quick overview of what moral psychology is. Moral psychology is a kind of blanket term for a pretty broad and active discipline. Depending on your definitions, it could be thousands of years old, but in terms of the actual modern science, it really only started to show up around 1930, or sort of the early 1930s, early 1920s, with people like Jean Piaget and Emile Durkheim. It's distinguished from moral philosophy in that its concerns with the sort of functional and behavioral components of morality. It's not a normative enterprise. Moral psychology isn't interested in telling you what is the right thing to do. It's just more interested in telling you or in investigating what people actually do in moral situations, irrespective of whether or not philosophically it's the right thing to do or not. It takes the tools and insights of academic psychology and applies them to the moral realm to answer questions like these. So, how are morals acquired? How do they develop and change over time? And how do we arrive at our moral judgments? How do we actually make them? What's going on inside your head when you're thinking morally? There aren't any definitive answers to these questions. At the moment, moral psychology is a field in the throes of paradigm shift. There's a lot of infighting, a lot of politics. For most of the 20th century, the field was dominated by a guy named Lawrence Kohlberg. He was a psychologist out of Harvard, and he proposed a sort of system of moral development and moral internalization called cognitive developmentalism. Borrowing from Piaget and Kant, Kohlberg argued that people go through distinct stages of moral development, and that these stages are characterized by a person's ability to think and reason about morality. For Kohlberg, cognition in the form of deliberative, effortful reason is the cornerstone of moral functioning and of moral development. But, that is a messy slide. Anyway, but for a variety of reasons, Kohlberg has since fallen out of favor among moral psychologists, and the cognitive developmental paradigm that he pioneered is no longer in fashion. Currently, there are a few promising alternatives trying to take Kohlberg's place, and though they differ significantly in terms of details, what they all emphasize is the fact that morality in a psychological sense is a kind of expertise. It's a set of skills, perceptual, emotional, social, cognitive, that you use to navigate social environments. This is as true, say, of Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionism theory as it is of Dan Houser's moral grammar theory. It's something that moral psychologists, despite their many differences right now, can all agree on. Now, one of the more compelling accounts of moral expertise is the four-component model proposed by James Rest and colleagues. According to this model, moral expertise can be broken down into four components, and those four components can be broken down into subcomponents, and those subcomponents can be broken down into sub-subcomponents. For now, we'll just concentrate on the four major ones, and they being moral sensitivity, which is the ability to identify morality as it exists in the real world, to know when a moral dilemma is actually facing you, and to be able to look at people's behavior and to sort of understand their motivations and understand their feelings when making moral decisions. Moral judgment. This is the ability to understand moral concepts and reason about moral issues. This is something that Kohlberg was very fond of and emphasized pretty much to the exclusion of everything else. Moral motivation. Now, this is something that moral exemplars, people who are noted for their moral behavior, tend to have in spades. It's the extent to which you're committed to your moral choices, and It's the extent to which you're willing to prioritize moral concerns over other concerns. And then finally, we've got moral action, which is the ability to overcome temptations and persist in the face of adversity, to do the right thing even when it's hard. Again, this is something that you see a lot in moral exemplars. Now, why is this at all relevant to game design? Well, I think if there's one thing that video games show, perhaps more than anything else, is that developing expertise can be enjoyable. If you look at Portal, for example, Portal is actually sort of the poster boy in this respect. Portal is essentially a 3-hour tutorial on how to use the portal gun. The whole game is developing expertise, and sort of developing expertise and developing mastery is something that people play games for generally. Now, what I think is that basically this is as true of moral expertise as it is of any other kind of expertise, and that moral psychology, therefore, is well positioned to offer insights to game designers looking to design moral content for their video games. So this is where we get back to the 4 components. The value of the 4-component model for designers is that it's a framework of construction for moral dilemmas and for just moral content more generally. Traditionally, moral dilemmas in video games, moral content in video games tends to emphasize judgment and action at the expense of everything else. Dilemmas, for example, tend to be very obviously signposted, and the player's moral agency is reduced to making a decision in dialogue, making a dialogue choice. But the thing with morality is that it's about more than just making choices. It's about more than a decision moment. It's about more than that crucial point where you decide between right or wrong. There are a lot of other skills involved in being a moral person. And I happen to think that games that do morality well, games like Spec Ops, games like Deus Ex, games like Planescape Torment, provide multiple opportunities for players to exercise these skills other than judgment and action. One such game is Deus Ex. Deus Ex is still amazing, by the way. It's like 13 years old now or something like that, and it's still the best game ever made. In Deus Ex, the player takes the role of an anti-terrorist agent. And there's this great point about halfway through the game where you're on a 747 and you're confronting this terrorist named Lebedev. Now, by this point in the game, it's not entirely clear whether Lebedev is actually a terrorist or not, and you're ordered by your superior, who's standing there right next to you, to kill Lebedev, even though he's surrendered and even though, he's completely unarmed. So basically what's happening here is that instead of having a big press X to shoot Lebedev prompt, for example, what the game does is that it gives you back control, gives you complete control. It just goes back to normal gameplay, and it's up to you as the player to spot opportunities for moral action and then to actually decide whether or not you want to act on them, and then act on them, and then live with the consequences. Basically, it takes all the 4 components and crams them right into this single amazing dilemma. Now, the player can do a lot of stuff here if they want to. The player can shoot Lebedev if they want. They can shoot the terrorist. They can just leave. They can just walk out and, have nothing else to do with it. They can shoot the person that's telling them to shoot Lebedev if they want. They can talk to the person who's giving you the order to shoot the terrorist if you want. You can talk to Lebedev himself. And in fact, if you keep talking to Lebedev, if you keep talking to the terrorist and keep pumping him for information, the person who orders you to shoot him gets pissy and shoots him himself. So there are all these consequences to all these actions, and not all of them are entirely obvious. And the thing about Deus Ex, one of the things that really makes Deus Ex a great game, in my opinion, and makes this particular dilemma so effective, is that by that point, it's trained you very, very well to pay attention to the consequences of your actions. There are multiple dilemmas like the Lebedev dilemma in Deus Ex, and they're sort of on an ascending scale of complexity. So by the time you get to him, you're like, oh, actually, should I be doing this? Is this the right thing to do? And is not doing anything the right thing to do? What's my stake in this? And it's one of the great things that, it's what makes Deus Ex such a great game. Now, this leads me to the idea of sort of moral complexity and moral difficulty. Kohlberg's no longer the reigning king of moral psychology, but many of his ideas have survived in a variety of slightly mutated forms. One of his more enduring contributions is this idea that certain ways of thinking about morality, certain ways of passing dilemmas are just more cognitively complex and more developmentally complex than others. This sort of filters through into his approach to education, where what he would do basically is he'd get a bunch of students, and over the course of a year or whatever, he would expose them to a variety of dilemmas and role-playing opportunities of gradually increasing complexity, so that he ends up being caught in what James Paul G calls the zone of proximal development. Now, this is sort of the area where the player/learner is, they're at the edge of their skills, and they're constantly being tested with sort of things that are just a little bit beyond them, a little bit beyond their scope, so that they're forced to adapt and forced to change and forced to develop. This is an idea that I think designers could adapt with some success to the design of moral content for video games. I think that by structuring moral challenges to be more like other challenges are structured, so from easy to hard, from simple to complex, what you're basically doing is that you're giving players an opportunity to develop the skills that you want to test later on. And this is not something that games do very often. A lot of the times, they'll just sort of throw you into a very complex and very difficult decision and give you no prep work for it. No way to develop the skills and the sort of the knowledge that you need to make these decisions effectively. And making decisions effectively is one of the great things about video games. It's mastery in a nutshell. When you know that you've got got a handle on something and can actually make a correct and reasonable decision. This is sort of leads into, this idea of cultivating skills, and cultivating moral skills obviously leads into the possibility of using games to teach moral skills that go beyond gaming. That maybe it's possible, if we can teach people to be moral in games, we can teach them to be moral outside of games. And this is what we've been doing. Malcolm and I and our colleagues have been doing, working on Revolution, which is a guerrilla warfare simulator. I don't really have the time to talk about it in depth now, but if you want to have a chat about it later, just come up and ask me about it. Now, getting your players interested in your moral content is only half the battle. You've got to be careful not to disengage them. You've got to be careful that they don't switch off their morality. You don't need to be a psychologist, for example, to know that people anthropomorphize things just as a matter of course. This morning I anthropomorphized, my cat, my keys, my computer in increasingly harsh terms. It's just something that people do. And it's apparently, according to research conducted by Vorman and Voderer, it's something that people do in video games too. People tend to naturally regard NPCs as social entities that have feelings, that have desires, and crucially, that have moral preferences that are worthy of moral respect. And the problem with a lot of games is that they either intentionally or unintentionally give players cues to dehumanize NPCs, to turn them into objects rather than people. One of the more common ways to do this, one of the more common ways to dehumanize NPCs, you often find this in RPGs, is where they make the villains so absurdly villainous, so incredibly evil and baby-killing that by the time you actually get to them, of course you're going to be inclined to dish out justice in the most severe possible way. But other times, it's a little more subtle than that, and it's something that I think game designers need to pay more attention to if they're interested in designing for moral engagement. For example, and this is particularly relevant to war games, is the issue of combat barks. Now, combat barks are, when in a war game, you've got people on the battlefield, and basically they constantly announce to you their status on the battlefield. They say, I need healing, or I'm out of grenades, or I'm going to attack someone, or something like that. Now, in terms of just game design, in terms of keeping the player abreast of what's happening on the battlefield, you need to do this. It's indispensable. People need to know what's going on. But the problem is that with this constant repetition of the same lines, with this constant sort of in-your-face, over and over and over again, what tends to happen is that everybody on the battlefield becomes like a kind of just a kind of automaton. Basically, a shrieking, bleating automaton that you kind of just want to shut up, and you don't really feel inclined to regard them as real moral entities. So just to finish this off and to give you sort of some take-home points, to recap, moral psychology is a discipline interested in how people think and act morally and how these capacities develop over time. Current literature on thinking and acting part tends to coalesce around the idea of morality as a kind of expertise, as a kind of skill. developing expertise in video games, whether it's expertise at shooting a gun or at matching gems or at negotiating in Civ, for example, is fun. And I don't see why moral expertise would be any different in this respect. The four-component model is a framework for understanding the expertise and for designing for it. But that's only half the picture. There's also the fact that when you're designing games for moral education and moral engagement, you've got to be sure not to design for moral disengagement. Some games do manage to get this right. The aforementioned Spec Ops, Deus Ex, The Walking Dead, Papers, Please, all of these games do it well, and these are the games that we're going to be looking for, me and my colleagues, when we get to making Revolution, hopefully early next year. And yeah, that's about it.